From Miami Law, I'm Annette Uguez, and this is The Explainer.
This movement really had the makings of kind of a new civil rights era.
In July 2016, a white police officer shot a black man who was lying on the ground with his hands in the air. Last week, the officer testified that he thought the man was a hostage and accidentally shot him. He was aiming for an autistic man sitting in the street holding a toy truck. The jury deadlocked on 2 counts of felony attempted manslaughter against a police officer, with a single juror holding out for a guilty verdict. With us today to look at the case and a wider discussion of officer-involved shootings in the Black Lives Matter world is Donald Jones, criminal and constitutional law professor and author of 3 books, including Dangerous Spaces, Beyond the Racial Profile. Let's go to executive producer Catherine Skip with the interview.
Good morning, Don. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Let's just start out by reminding our listeners what happened in July 2016 with the mental health therapist, Charles Kinsey.
Charles Kinsey was working at a group home, and his job was at that time, to retrieve a patient at the home, Arnaldo Soto, who had wandered off. And so this is a normal day. He's simply trying to take charge of a mental health patient who has wandered off. And unfortunately, the mental health patient has a toy truck in his hand. And as Charles Kinsey is innocently trying to bring him back, someone has reported the mental patient with the toy truck as a man with a gun. And so the police come in arms, in anxiety, attempting to disarm what they think is a suspect with a gun. Now, what video shows is that Charles Kinsey had his hands in the air, and he said clearly, the suspect, the person you think is a suspect, is unarmed. And so, from everyone who saw the video, they were appalled when, despite his warnings and protestations, and the mental patient looks so innocent and so harmless. Nonetheless, a police officer with a rifle fires 3 times and hits Charles Kinsey, who is also unarmed, despite the fact he has his hands up.
And the purported hostage in the situation.
Right. And so people are incredulous. Frederica Wilson says she's appalled. Everybody saw it. It reels back in horror. Now, what's interesting, too, is that before the shooting occurred, an officer on the scene radios to everyone that this child is, in fact, unarmed. And despite the radio broadcast, despite Charles Kinsey holding his hands in the air, despite the fact that the child is holding nothing more than a toy truck that has a shape of a gun, the officer shoots. And it's hard to explain. It's difficult to watch. It's emotionally wrenching. And that led to a criminal trial in which Officer John, I think Alceda, I don't know if I have his name right, was prosecuted for manslaughter. Mm-hmm. And I think that what's interesting is that these are human situations. And what I think we're doing is we're grafting a narrative onto these situations, which has a lot to do with an incredible pattern of injustice and savage injustice that people of color are experiencing in urban America now and have been experiencing for many years. And it's certainly true that, for example, in 2019, 209 people were shot already. And in 2018, 1,100 people are shot. In 2017, another 1,100 people are shot.
And these were officer-involved shootings?
Right. And blacks are 3 times as likely to be killed by a police officer than a white. And 30% of the blacks who are killed are unarmed. Mm-hmm. And so despite the fact they're unarmed, they're killed. Despite the fact that blacks are, in this post-civil rights era, equal citizens, 3 times as likely to be shot by the police. And it's that narrative which is driving the outrage.
Okay. Well, you contend that the issue of officer-involved shootings is larger than just bad apples.
Yes. I think that, one of the problems that we have is systemic discrimination within the criminal justice system. And let me give you a description of what some of that systemic discrimination is. In New York, when New York was prosecuting its war on guns, and that was the name that they used, and ironically, many of the police officers and officers in charge of the commanders were Black. They disproportionately targeted neighborhoods which were predominantly Black and brown. And so I think Black neighborhoods were half as likely to possess guns, but yet they were twice as likely. People who live in those neighborhoods were twice as likely to be stopped. And this was all revealed in Floyd versus New York, the New York stop and frisk case. Twice as likely to be stopped, half as likely to possess the guns. And people were appalled by this disparity. And what's happening is that the New York Police Department were targeting neighborhoods which were high crime areas. Targeting high crime areas. And those so-called high crime areas almost always happen to be Black and brown. Mm-hmm. And I think that's due to the connection between poverty and crime. So whether they were doing it consciously or not, systemically, they were targeting Black and brown neighborhoods. And it's the systemic disproportion, which I think is driving the disproportion in Blacks being shot so often.
Mm-hmm. So the Black Lives Matter movement really had its roots in Florida after the self-appointed neighborhood watch volunteer, yes, George Zimmerman, was acquitted in the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. Can you talk a little about how the movement has, as it gained momentum, changed the landscape and how we may or may not view police shootings 7 years after Trayvon's murder?
The Black Lives Matter movement comes alive almost as if a generation which had been sleeping was waking up when Trayvon Martin was shot by George Zimmerman, who was the neighborhood watchman that you mentioned. Trayvon Martin was an innocent child who had just gone to the store to buy a bag of Skittles. And coming back from the store in a hoodie and saggy pants, the George Zimmerman sees him and thinks this must be one of the people who is responsible for the break-ins in his neighborhood in Sanford. And he follows him without probable cause, without reasonable suspicion, based on the fact that he's Black and he's wearing a hoodie. And Trayvon sees himself followed by a strange man and is frightened. And somewhere in that confrontation filled with fear and racism, Trayvon Martin is shot by George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin being unarmed. And his death, the death of an innocent child, the death at the hands of an unarmed innocent child, at the hands of a man who's armed, much older than him, woke up a generation of mostly Blacks, particularly the 3 Black women who started it, and they began a national campaign and ignited a national movement for accountability with respect to police shootings and reform of the criminal justice system insofar as it deals with people of color.
Was it just the time was right, or the incident was so horrific? It wasn't that there were shootings before.
I think there's a convergence of factors. I think one factor is the technological change. The social media is far more present with us now. We're much more of a global village, connected by the internet, by Twitter, by Facebook, by a variety of means that were impossible before. People can blog they can do a podcast in their backyard. And so I think the technology has given us access to communicate with each other in a way that was possible in the past only by mainstream media outlets. And at the same time, I think it was also true that you had a generation coming of age, so what I call a post-civil rights generation, who had the belief that these problems were solved, that we were becoming post-racial, and Obama had been elected. It's a new day. And this shattered that complacency. This shattered the sense that there was anything like a post-racial America. The shattering of the narrative, the access to global interconnectivity, all of that comes together to facilitate and help drive this movement.
Mm-hmm. Yes, never before did we actually see Black men being shot by police in real time.
Right. The cell phones started clicking more and more, and it's interesting that and we have this is occurring during the time when we had a Black presidency. I'm nostalgic for that era, by the way, and so this movement really had the makings of kind of a new civil rights era. It brought together people from all walks of life, and many of them were college students. Many of them were people who were far more educated than the people who staffed the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s.
And where do you see the progress in the last 7 years? Well,
I think that they've had an enormous impact. I think you see a cottage industry of lawyers, therapists coming together to try to figure out how we heal this. They developed de-escalation programs. There's a new spate, a new generation of district attorneys who are now reform-minded, who want to end this, who want to make things better. So you have a new generation of district attorneys. You have new sets of training programs. You have law schools which are now focusing on this problem that was invisible before. So it's gone from invisible to visible. It's gone from no attention to being on the front burner and being pushed by a new generation of professionals who are now wielding in many cities the reins of power. In Philadelphia, in New Orleans, Blacks, people who are allies to civil rights movement, are taking the reins of power. So there is a new sense that we're going to hold police accountable. In Miami, you have Don Horn, who is one of the leaders in the state's attorney's office, who is helping to make this a reality. So much more response from in Baltimore, you had a district attorney who was Black who tried to indict 6 Baltimore policemen who she felt were guilty in the killing of Freddie Gray. It didn't work, but it's symbolic of a new wave of leaders, a new sense of accountability that it's steamrolling itself throughout our society.
So you think in the case that we're talking about, the trial last week,
yes,
that case wouldn't have made it to trial, even though it didn't. Well,
there wouldn't have been an indictment.
Right. And then we had 2 instances in the last week in Miami, one where a Black woman was shot to death by a police officer in a traffic stop, and a woman who called 911 because someone had pointed a shotgun at her, and she's taken down hard and arrested.
Yes, and I think
not there yet.
I think that the problem is still there. And I think one of the problems you have is that you can't, we cannot arrest our way out of the problem. We can't prosecute our way out of the problem. The problem is structural. And by structural, I mean there's several components to it which go deep into our society. So, for example, one aspect of the problem is that Blacks still, to this day, are disproportionately poor. And disproportionately, they have less power. Another aspect that's troubling is that we still have a culture which is deeply polluted with racial stereotypes. And so, for example, if you look at the news, even today, the news in Black communities is disproportionately focused on drugs and violence. If we look at the films that are produced about Blacks in inner cities, they're typically films about Blacks operating as thugs, gangsters, and drug dealers. And so these stereotypes that are drawn from culture it's almost like it fills the atmosphere and we breathe it in like smog. And so policemen who are part of the culture breathe this in as well. And so I think it affects everything from who they arrest, who they stop, to who they kill.
Where do we go from here?
Well, I think that what we've got to realize is that there are bad apples, but I think that it's more than a few bad apples. It's a rotten barrel, and that rotten barrel represents the culture of stereotyping that exists, and it represents institutional policies and practices which need to change. This business that we're going to police by high crime areas, which tends to mean that we're going to over police communities of color. We've got to change that. I think that the whole idea that we actually need to shoot first or to rush in first has got to change. We've got to think in terms of how we avoid confrontation, how we avoid conflict, of how we create a situation where we don't have to make arrests. One example would be for example, with marijuana, there should be no arrest. Right now in Florida, medical marijuana is legal, but it's still a crime to possess marijuana for recreational use. And while it's discretionary to arrest someone for marijuana possession, police still do arrest people for marijuana. That shouldn't be. We should eliminate crimes such as that. In Fort Lauderdale, people are getting arrested for riding bicycles without registration. We still have this
bicycles?
Yes. There still is this broken windows concept that by having zero tolerance for certain kinds of crimes, that's going to reduce bigger crime. And I think that we've got to re-examine and rethink that. I think we need to have less arrests, less people put in jail, and instead of trying to use the police as the means of bringing order, we've got to use education. We've got to find other ways, alternatives to police confrontation. And I think that's really where law schools come in as well. We have to help the police think through how we develop not just police with more empathy, but police policies and practices which reflect a new level of awareness and understanding.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us at The Explainer. If you like the show, leave us a 5-star review on your podcast platform and tell your friends to subscribe. You can always drop us a comment at explainer@miami.edu. Our show is engineered and edited by Christopher Alzadi with theme music composed by Ray D. Kim from the Frost School of Music. I'm your host, Annette Uguez. Today's show was brought to you by the Managing Compliance Across Borders program at Miami Law, June 26th through the 28th. The interactive executive level program is aimed at compliance, risk, and audit management counsel and executives from firms and corporations around the world. For more information, visit www.law.miami.edu/CLE.